What was your number one goal when it came to birthing and breastfeeding? My guest today prepared as much as anybody could for birthing and breastfeeding. And for the most part, she had the experiences that she wanted. Even though she gave birth in September of 2020, which, if you remember, there wasn't a vaccine out, there was still very little support, and most of us were still quite isolated in our homes at this time. My guest, Jen, did the prep work she needed to do to feel as prepared and empowered as possible, and she set herself up for success in the postpartum period by creating the support she needed. So I'm so excited to have you hear Jen's story of breastfeeding for 2.5 years since 2020 and still going strong. Even though her breastfeeding experiences weren't without difficulty, she showed that she had the agency and she had the primary voice to be able to make the right decisions as they came. When I began breastfeeding, I was blindsided by how difficult it was. Having known only a handful of people who had ever done it and only seeing it up close a couple of times, I had a huge learning curve. Since then, I've become a doula, a childbirth educator, and an internationally board-certified lactation consultant, or an IBCLC. I'm your host, Lo Nigrosh, and I welcome you to the Milk Making Minutes, where we explore the systemic, medical, and cultural barriers that make feeding our babies so difficult, so that you know your baby feeding struggles are not your fault, and your triumphs really are the miracles you feel they are.
So I live in West Springfield, Massachusetts. I have a son who is 2 years, 9 months old, and I'm a full-time birth doula and childbirth educator, and my husband is a high school teacher.
Great.
Yeah.
So before we talk about your actual baby feeding stories, I'm going to take you back into
Sure.
your memory trove as far back as you can think about your upbringing and have you name what your exposure to baby feeding was as a child and a teenager and into your 20s. Were you surrounded by breastfeeding at all? Did you see it ever? Talk about what your cultural exposure was.
I remember from a very young age having baby dolls with bottles and mimicking that. I was thinking about this question before our chat today and trying to remember if I witnessed anyone breastfeeding before the age of 10, and I think the answer is no. It was mostly witnessing formula feeding, and I believe my mom breastfed all 3 of her kiddos, but for short amounts of time, and I think I was for 3 months, and that was the longest out of all 3 of us. So that's as far back as I can think, but I can tell you a little bit more about my 20s. In grad school, my sister had her first kiddo, and she was kind of the trailblazer along with my older cousin for all of us cousins in the family. And she was very interested in attachment parenting and really committed to feeding her baby with human milk. And I was in grad school, she was in grad school, so we had a little bit of flexibility in terms of visiting. So I got to visit her after she had my nephew. And I remember seeing her pumping while typing an essay on her computer and thinking, oh my gosh, that looks so hard. And yet she's rocking it. And it looks like a full-time commitment. That was maybe the first real exposure that I had to breast milk.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And did she talk to you at all about her struggles and what it was like feeding human milk?
Definitely. I remember her telling me a lot about sleep deprivation. That was a big piece of the journey. I also remember her sharing a lot of the triumphs too, and sharing that it was a parenting tool. So that was maybe the first time that that had been exposed to me as well.
Like feeding her baby from her body was a parenting tool,
Yes, yes,
like a way to calm her baby, a way to soothe her
exactly.
baby. Okay.
Exactly. And she also had another kiddo several years later, and I remember traveling. She lived out of the States for a long time, so we traveled together from Vietnam to the States with her two kids. One was about 4 and one was about 5 months old, and I remember on this really long flight, like more than 24 hours of being on a plane with just me, her, and her two kids, and she was basically breastfeeding my niece the whole entire time.
Mm.
And it was so cool for me to watch her do that and soothe her in a circumstance that to me could have been a little bit more stressful, but she had this tool that made the experience more easeful for all of us.
Yeah. One
Yeah.
of my early episodes, I had a friend on. We were former coworkers, and we both had to travel a lot for our previous jobs. And we had kids we had our first children within a few months of each other. And she talks about how she would be traveling and she would have a baby with her, and people would be giving her the side eye, and she'd be like, "Oh, don't even worry, I'm breastfeeding." Like, I've got this.
Right.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
remember feeling that too on the plane, like, "Oh my gosh, what would I do if I didn't breastfeed?"
Yeah, it was something I was really in awe of. So that was something that entirely changed my understanding of what the feeding journey could look like. And then my dear friend who had her first child right around after I got married, so I was really curious and kind of like watching her every move and seeing like how she got to make all of these really unique and tough parenting choices. And I remember her with her feeding journey, it went relatively smoothly, and that was my second closest exposure. She asked me to actually photograph her feeding her son when he was about like 8 months old, because she didn't know how much longer it would last. It did last several years beyond
Mm.
that little photo
Mhm.
session. But I remember taking photos of her breastfeeding her son and thinking, wow, this is so relational. This is such a way of mothering that I didn't really have any exposure to before.
Mm.
And I wasn't ready to have a child yet, but I knew in that moment when I saw this type of connectivity, that like feeding your baby could be this type of connection, that I really wanted that someday.
Yeah, isn't it so fascinating that those of us who had the privilege of seeing baby feeding in that way then knew that that's how we wanted it to be for us. Whether or
Yes.
not some people know that that's how they want it, and it doesn't work out for them that way. But to
Right.
know that when you see that, you want that is
Absolutely.
pretty fascinating. I hear that a lot. And
Definitely.
it's interesting that so few of us got to see that.
Right. I actually found when I first started parenting, my mom gave me a bunch of old things because grandparents are sweet like that and give you things, mementos that you can add to your collection. And she had this calendar where she wrote down each day something that she wanted to remember about her
Oh.
parenting journey. I know it's such a commitment. I can't say I've done the same. Like every day for the first year. It's wild and beautiful. And I got to the 3-month mark and I saw it said like today was my last day of breastfeeding Jen, and I'm feeling really really overwhelmed and sad about it. And
Oh,
I was just
wow.
like, wow. So I asked her about it and she told me that it was mostly a recommendation from her pediatrician to start using formula. And so it was just a fascinating look into what parenting was like and in the 80s and early 90s,
Mm.
and how things are a bit different now, but still some barriers there.
How amazing that you actually know the exact date that your mom's stopped feeding, and
Yeah,
how amazing that she was able to feed you for those 3 months at a time when it wasn't
definitely.
very common.
Yes, I agree to both of those statements
Mhm.
100%. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Very rare to look back and to be able to have that information for sure.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay, so you had these 2 early influences,
definitely.
and then it was your turn. So tell us about, so your family is starting, so what kind of preparation did you do specifically for baby feeding? And then you can move into your birth story as it relates to breastfeeding.
It was easy for me to think about breastfeeding because my dear closest friend in the world was breastfeeding her child, and we spoke every day. So my between my sister and a friend that's practically a sister, I was constantly hearing about and seeing the feeding journey unfold in a relatively smooth way. So I had very maybe unrealistic expectations that my my journey would go smoothly as well. To prepare, I did take hypnobirthing for childbirth education when I was pregnant with our son, and there was a bit of feeding preparation in that course, but I knew after taking the course, like, okay, I've got all of the information and the values that I now have about childbirth, but now the feeding preparation begins. So I started reading, and I don't love the title of this text, but I started reading The Womanly Art of Breastfeeding. And that was a really helpful text, especially to turn to in the middle of the night when my partner and I had questions that weren't answered by an easy Google search. And my friend who had been breastfeeding for several years also was a lactation educator. So she was my go-to person for asking all the things, like, if I have small breasts, does that mean that my milk supply is going to be low? And just the normal questions that you have before you even meet your baby. So she was my go-to person who would constantly send me evidence-based resources to dive into and explore further.
Yeah, The Womanly Art of Breastfeeding, although it could have a better title, it is a pretty good resource for anyone who's looking for
Yeah,
something. It shows really great positions and great problem solving in there. And there's only so much you can learn from a book.
exactly. And it was a great place to start.
Mhm.
And I worked with the midwives at a freestanding birth center out here in Western Mass. So I knew that working with really seasoned midwives, they had a ton of experience supporting folks in their feeding journeys, and they had access to some really wonderful lactation professionals as well. So I knew I was setting myself up with a team of support if some twists and turns presented themselves. But the tricky piece of that was that the birth center was just opening. And so I think it was easy for me to just contact the midwives and ask the questions. But right now, they have a lactation professional who you just spoke to recently. But they didn't at the time. And so I was a little bit worried with their beginnings and opening of the birth center. Like, was I bothering them with my lactation questions because they were just trying to start this this incredible freestanding birth center from the ground up? And so I was hesitant to ask for support in that space because of the circumstances.
That's
Which,
interesting.
yeah,
Yeah, so it was until now, the only freestanding birth center in the entire state of Massachusetts.
right,
There's a
right.
second one opening right now in Worcester.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, very exciting. And
Yeah.
they I think they received their official approval to open maybe a few weeks before we gave birth. So we trusted them
Wow.
so
To
much.
get their stuff done.
Yeah.
I mean, was there like a backup plan?
Yes, backup plan was to birth at the hospital that they are connected to
Okay.
nearby.
Okay.
But we were just so hopeful that it would all work out, and we had such a wonderful connection with them, that we put a lot of hope in the fact that it would open by the time our baby arrived,
Yeah, and it did.
and it did. It did. Sometimes it all works out.
Yeah, yeah. And the lactation professional that you're referring to is Lex Beach, who
Yes.
she is featured on episodes 119 and 121. So anyone who wants to hear
Exciting.
her stories, you can go back and listen to those. And she tells her breastfeeding stories and kind of how they shaped her professional life. Okay, so then tell me what impact you think your birth might have had on
Mm.
your breastfeeding experiences.
I had a remarkably positive birth experience, which I know, especially having been to so many births over the last several years, that is not always the case. It was very empowering. It was altering in all ways. It changed my relationship to myself, my body, and my mind. It was truly incredible. And to have that right at the start of my feeding journey, I think was lucky and allowed me to dive into the feeding journey with my son with a lot of trust in my body. And I'm so grateful for that piece because that's not how it always goes.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. It's really, really hard when you
yeah,
don't get the birth experience that you hoped for, that you worked for, that you planned for,
right.
because some people, they do all the right things and it still doesn't work out. And then you start off your feeding relationship with this lack of oxytocin, with
Right.
high stress. And then feeding becomes way more difficult.
Definitely. And I do remember, although I had this positive birth experience and I had this previously positive exposure to folks who had, many years of breastfeeding their children, that I still was nervous. I had a lot of questions. I remember calling one of the midwives in after they stepped out, after the perineal repair took place, and they kind of stepped out to go do some charting. And I remember looking at my partner and being like, "I need them to come back and help me. I need them to come back immediately. I don't know what I'm doing." And one of them showed me how to do a couple of different holds, which I had actually practiced prenatally. I had practiced and I practiced a bunch of different holds, and I thought that would kind of like give me some confidence and muscle memory to hold my real baby. But once my real baby was there and kind of like flopping around and doing all of these like really wild newborn movements, I was like, oh gosh,
Yeah,
how
it's
do
very different.
it's very different. And one of the midwives came in and asked if they could show me how to do the football hold. And he latched almost right away. And I don't have much footage from my birth in terms of photographs and videos, but my husband kind of accidentally took a video of the first latch. And
Oh,
we found it the other day, and I was like, oh my gosh, my face just was so in shock of the the intensity of just like a new sensation that I'd never felt before. And it's just so cool to have that to
yeah.
look back on. But the beginning of the journey was really, really smooth. I would say for the most part, we fed my son Ferris, by listening to his cues. He was a very clear communicator from the start. So we did have that going for us. And we gave birth to him at 7:11 in the morning. And because it's a short stay facility, we were home by noon. And we were just very held in those first few days, first few weeks.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Last night, as a family, we had the rare opportunity to just have one child at home. We had not eaten dinner yet, and it was getting pretty late, but we asked him, "It's just the three of us. What would you like to do?" And my son said he wanted to take a walk at a nearby reservoir. And neither my husband and I were stressed out about this because we had a refrigerator full of Feast and Fettle, which had delivered home cooked meals right to our front door that we knew when we came home from our walk, all we would have to do was just heat and serve it. So off we went on our walk right around sunset around the reservoir. It was beautiful, just the three of us and our dog. And then we came home, and within 15 minutes, we had the most delicious coconut crusted cod and roasted cauliflower. And we ate it while we played Uno together. And the cleanup was so easy. And it made our evening so amazing after a full day of work and allowed us to connect with our child. And this is why I am so happy that Feast and Fettle is a partner of the podcast, because I truly believe that anything that allows families to spend more time together and less time worrying about all the things they need to do, like getting dinner on the table, is something I can get behind. So if you would like to see what Feast and Fettle can do for your family, go to feastandfettle.com and use my code MILK to get $30 off your first week's order. And let somebody else do the cooking for you and just go take that walk. If you want to have less anxiety and more confidence so that your parenting journey can feel like you always wanted it to feel, then go to my website right now so that you can have a person by your side who not only knows how you feel, but who combines my expertise of lactation with your expertise of your body and your baby to help you make the next right step in your lactation journey, because that's all you really need to do is make the next right step. And right now, that next right step is going to my website, www.quavinbirthservices.com. And I can't wait to see your name pop up in my inbox or on my phone, on my text messages. Talk to you soon. So, one thing that I often see is that things will be going well initially in the first couple of days when it's just the colostrum. And then when that transitional milk comes in, there can be more difficulty as both the parent and the baby learn to deal with more milk. So, tell me about that time for you.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that. Because we were both learning a new skill, that was constantly something that I was reminding myself. And that was helpful to a certain point. And then when my milk did come in, I think on about day 4, I had quite a challenge with engorgement. My son was a very, very big baby, and he was also a very hungry baby. And I think it took more than the average for the supply to kind of balance out to a point where it was not feeling like an incredible oversupply. So we made it work with a lot of troubleshooting, a lot of reaching out to the midwives, a lot of like calling as soon as I felt like something was off. If I had a milk blister or there was engorgement, I would go on to Kelly Mom and in the middle of the night and look at ways in which I could support myself until I could call the midwives in the morning. But I do remember probably from about weeks 2 to 5 feeling like there were new pains, new sensations that I needed support working out, especially in those cluster feeding times because he was just a pretty ravenous milk monster.
Mm-hmm. You were really lucky that you could, call or text the midwives. That's way more support than most of us get. But we evolved in these groups where we were surrounded by all sorts of people who had experienced milk making and milk feeding. And there were just so many more people there taking care of us, helping work through the engorgement, helping us work through any difficulties that might come up, feeding the baby for you so you could rest. If you had a ravenous milk monster, that's okay. There's somebody else there
Right.
to help with that. And now so many of us are just in our houses alone, figuring this out with no precedent.
Right.
And when we evolved in these groups, we were seeing this from our earliest days. We might have seen our own parent and older siblings do this time and time again. And there's no wonder that it feels so strange and so new when it becomes our turn.
Right.
Because that's not how we evolved to do this.
Right. I should also mention that this was during the time of pre-vaccine pandemic. So this was September 2020 was when we gave birth to our son, and that played a huge role in our feeding journey, fortunately and unfortunately. So there's a bunch I could say about that.
Yeah, in some ways, I've had a lot of people actually who gave birth during the pandemic, pre-vaccine pandemic. And, in some ways they felt a little more like, oh, they could be at home focusing on their family, not as many people coming in to disrupt that postpartum time. And then in other ways, they were like, oh my gosh. I had one guest, New York City, pre-pandemic, and she had a cesarean and she left the hospital like within 24 hours to just heal at home with
Wow.
no help.
Wow.
Yeah.
The postpartum experience was very unique because we didn't have anyone coming to see us other than our immediate family, and even that was on a very restricted basis because we just didn't know. We just
Mhm.
didn't have a lot of information. It was still a relatively new experience that people were having. But I did know that breastfeeding could potentially help my son's body fight against COVID if he got it, to build those antibodies. And that felt like a great motivator, but it also could have been my greatest downfall if it hadn't worked out, because I think I would have
Mhm.
felt a lot of guilt around that. And it was a time where people were craving community, and I was working with other moms who had just had babies to try to find consistent community. So we were creating virtual support groups just to meet weekly to talk to one another about whatever was going on, and we would co-facilitate. So we would just trade off who would be facilitating each week. And most of the birthers in that space were breastfeeding. So I had that advantage as well, that we would be on the screen like 10 moms or so, 10 gestational parents who were feeding their babies with human milk. And even though we weren't together, it felt like a circle of community. It felt very instinctual, and at the same time we were learning about the struggles that others were having and helping each other through that process. Like, I wasn't the only one who was dealing with a milk bleb, or I wasn't the only one who was having a baby that spit up more than usual. And it was a helpful, consistent support space that I think people aren't craving as much now, and was really a helpful tool for me at the time.
I think people crave it, but they're not going to the right places to get it.
I think that too. Yeah.
I think they go to the big groups on Facebook and, maybe they go on Instagram and follow particular influencers and they try to get that connection there, but it's not the same as having a group of people who and can form a relationship with, even if it's on a screen. It's a totally different thing. And there are studies that show us that the thing that makes the difference between meeting your breastfeeding goals and not is how supported you feel. And that's not just by your IBCLC or by your
Right.
midwife. It's by the people you surround yourself with and those who have a group of people they can go to week in and week out to ask these kinds of questions. And sometimes those group of people are like, yeah, that's not normal. You need to go see an IBCLC. You can kind of learn what is in the range of normal and what's not by hearing so many experiences of other people feeding babies. That's
Right.
amazing that you were able to create that.
It was pretty incredible. It stemmed from a prenatal yoga group that we
Mm.
had met, and I was craving community so badly during that very isolating time that I would just like stop during the middle of yoga class and like put in the Zoom chat to one of the other moms like, "Hey, I'm this many weeks pregnant. I'm looking to kind of just find some new friends who are also in the similar season of life. And then we'd start like emailing and texting and meeting up at parks and socially distant spaces. So it definitely required some effort. And I think it also required a lot of folks to step outside of their typical friend making comfort zone. And I wish I saw more of that now, but it's something it's a good reminder. Yeah.
Yeah. Are you still in contact with those same people?
Yes, we are all in contact. We get together every so often. Our kiddos are all toddlers now, and some of these families have two children now, so it's, as you know, tricky to get together. But when we do, there's definitely there's a strong layer of connection, and we've all had very, very different feeding journeys too.
Yeah, that's great that you can just
Yeah.
be there and support each other despite how it turned out.
Definitely. Yeah, and I would say my greatest challenge with Ferris was actually the oversupply, which caused, I think, quite a bit of a spit up issue, which we got checked out by all of our providers, and everyone just kept coming back and saying like he's just a happy spitter. And I eventually, after many, many months of talking with local practitioners of all different kinds, chiropractor, pediatrician, the midwives, lactation professionals, and just getting all of the different feedback and resources. He really just was a happy spitter, and he would just expel what he didn't need. But it became a part of our lifestyle to just like be constantly covered in breast milk and burp cloths. And I had such an oversupply that I was still wearing breast pads regularly until like the beginning of his second year of life.
Wow.
Yeah.
So did you ever try to do anything to mitigate the oversupply?
Yes, we did.
You're like,
We
of course I did, low.
did.
Like, dumb question. What were the things you did to try to mitigate your oversupply?
I'm trying to remember what specific things. Block feeding comes to mind. That comes to mind. I think I tried some things that were not really lactation professional approved by just being like, if I wait a little bit longer, then that created an opposite problem. It always was just like a problem until we got regulated again. And cluster feeding and his growth spurts would be the thing that exacerbated the issue. So I kept just telling myself it's going to be a temporary season of a little bit more oversupply, and then we'll get through it. And those oversupply moments also accompanied by milk blisters were very challenging.
So would his latch change to accommodate the oversupply when your supply would upregulate?
Yes. Yes, it would. And in hindsight, I wish I had gotten a little bit more support at that time, because I just accepted it as a normal part of our feeding journey. Perhaps because I was so isolated. We weren't feeding around a lot of people, and so the spit up and like the constant covering myself in breast milk via spit up was something that I was like, all right, I guess this is just kind of our thing now. And once he started to eat more solids after 6 months, he did regulate that a little bit more. And the most practitioners told us that it had something to do with his anatomy, and that something about his throat, the sphincter muscle was not quite developed in a way that would allow for less spit up. And so I just kind of kept hoping for that moment, like a sweet spot that we would get to where we wouldn't have to deal with this much longer. And it did get better and better as time went on.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like you were trying to seek out support for the difficulty, but if it was related to oversupply, who knows? There's so much you can think about in hindsight.
I'm curious what your go-to moves are for somebody that has an oversupply.
there's various things we can do. Block feeding can sometimes help.
Yeah.
Sometimes it doesn't help.
Right.
There are some things we can do, like if a baby is spitting up a lot, we can try to get to the fattier milk and do some shaking up of the breasts, expressing a little bit of milk before baby starts to feed. And so they can take in that fatty milk towards the end. Sometimes some teas can help. So working with an herbalist to try to see if some sage tea or some mint tea can kind of help mitigate. So I really try to work with each person individually and see what
Right.
is the feeding schedule, how often is baby feeding, is it both sides? But it sounds like for you it was a little bit cyclical.
Right. Definitely cyclical. And he was always in like the 99th percentile for
Yeah.
growth. So I think he's just always been like a very tall,
Yeah.
bigger than average kiddo who just kept putting in an order for a lot of milk.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes you can do a lot to mitigate and sometimes you're just kind of doing that balancing act of
Definitely.
trying to help with the engorgement and keeping everybody safe and healthy while you do
Right.
so.
I like the idea of working with an herbalist. I think that's one practitioner that I didn't reach out to. And as someone who would consider myself a very rookie herbalist who's like just starting to
Mm.
learn about the power of herbs and plants and how they can connect to our bodies, that makes so much sense to me. So I'm excited about having that info for the future.
Yeah, yeah. I actually have interviewed a couple of herbalists for the podcast, and
Yes.
I don't know much, only as it relates to lactation. Do I know anything about herbalism? But they have such a wide range of knowledge about so many things. And I think it's so important to work with an herbalist who understands herbalism as it relates to women's health and lactation is really important.
Yes,
Yeah. So when I have clients who are interested in going that route, I always make sure to refer them to somebody who's very knowledgeable in this area in particular.
definitely.
So you were dealing with the oversupply, and that was a little bit cyclical. And the milk blebs, how were you treating milk blebs?
I think I remember doing some like leaning over and Epsom salt soak. I remember working with the midwife to like pop it and then soothe it with something. Gosh, I'm trying to remember what else too. I used a lot of organic nipple butter as it was healing. I used breast milk a lot to help it heal.
Mm-hmm.
It was very challenging. I think I try to forget about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah. And were they painful during nursing and outside of nursing?
definitely. More so during nursing. I think from about 4 to 6 months, there was a time period where it was just almost excruciatingly painful when he was nursing, and I would just cry when he was nursing, and I ended up going in to see the midwife and just had her look at it, and I was like, this is the thing that keeps coming back. And so we talked about, I forget what we had talked about, using something like sunflower lecithin, but I know like some recommendations around that have changed. So yeah, a lot has changed in the last couple of years in terms of like what's recommended to do with that. So that's what I remember.
Yeah, that's challenging. Tell me how it went from there. So that was 4 to 6 months. Then he started eating solids, and it
Yes,
seemed to kind of get better from there.
seemed to get better, but I do have to admit that I thought he was going to really, really like food.
Oh,
And
no.
I don't think he actually started really liking food until about 18 months. So
Mm.
we did start with some baby-led weaning in terms of the approach that we took with introducing solids, and it was fun. It was experimental, it was messy, it was chaotic, but we had a blast with it. But I just kept thinking, oh, I really thought he was going to eat more food and not nurse as much. And that was an expectation that just had to shift over time. And we are actually still nursing at 2 years, 9 months now.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, but he actually likes food now, so I'm happy to report.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I put out an episode. It's episode 118, and it's actually about how milk changes over time
Yeah.
and the anthropological and biological natural age of weaning, both from humans and other mammals. And one of the things that I mention is that often when a child is still breastfeeding, but they're not too into food, often they get told, well, if you wean them, then they will be more into food. But actually, what we see in the data is that if you wean them, that child might fall off their growth curve because they receive so much caloric intake and also so much high protein. It's lower in fat intake by the time they're toddlers, but so much good nutritional content from the milk that they are receiving so much great stuff from the breast milk that it creates a great supplement for kids who aren't too into food. And that if you remove breast milk, then that's when you start to worry about them falling off their growth curve. But if a
Right.
child is not too into food and they're still breastfeeding, you actually don't need to worry because
Right.
eventually they're going to be into food. And if they're not, that's when you would see a feeding specialist.
Right.
Um, but they will eventually be into food and show less interest in breast milk. And that's why breast milk changes over time to meet the needs of that growing child.
I just listened to that episode of yours,
Oh, you
and
did?
it was very validating.
Yeah, because when people are saying, "Well, if you would wean him, he might eat more,"
Right, right, right. Science says that's the move.
right? It's so fascinating. Yeah. So, were you able to was anybody criticizing you about how little he liked food, or?
Definitely. Yeah, I think some family members were maybe surprised because there wasn't a lot of previous exposure to breastfeeding beyond 3 or 6 months, and there are other family members who have a different feeding journey, and so it can be tricky to see like different cousins sitting next to each other at the table eating the same meal and eating a very, very different amount, and then the meal that my son is not eating as much of starts to look like a concern, but I'm also still breastfeeding quite a bit, and so that information sat well with me but was tricky to explain to the onlookers of that situation. Yeah, it was very, very interesting. And I also do remember a conversation with our former pediatrician. We ended up shifting to just find someone whose values aligned a little bit more with us. But they had mentioned something about starting to wean from night feedings and starting to also make sure that we take a cloth and wipe his teeth after I nurse him through every night feeding so that he wouldn't get cavities. And I just remember thinking like, I don't think this is evidence-based, but something tells me something tells me that I'm being a little bit judged for continuing to nurse and not wiping his teeth after feeding him in the middle of the night.
Yeah, if he were prone to cavities, it might
Yeah.
be something you needed to do. Like I nursed my daughter I nursed my son until he was 3.5, and I nursed my daughter till she was 4.5.
Cool.
And my son, to this day, he's almost 10, has never had a cavity. My
Right.
daughter, who is almost 6, has had a mouthful of cavities.
Got it.
And so when we went to that first dentist appointment where she had so many cavities and I was still breastfeeding her, of course, I did not tell the dentist I was still breastfeeding her, but I left that information to myself. But I knew that the way that certain babies' mouths, the oral anatomy shapes up,
Right.
if any sugars just stay in the mouth for any amount of time, including the sugars in breast milk, it could lead to decay. Is it going to be the primary culprit? No. However, because I had a child who was still breastfeeding through the night, I did decide that and because she was like, I don't know, 3.5 at that time, I was like, you know what? We are going to stop breastfeeding through the night. But that was a choice I made. Nobody told me. But she had this mouthful of cavities. And I thought, I can do this one thing to see if it's going to
Mm.
help. Did it help? No. She continued to get tons of cavities after that. And it turns out she is just genetically predisposed to cavities.
Right.
But, when it comes to the cavity thing with teeth,
Right.
unless there is a problem, if there is a problem, then yes, let's make sure to prevent more problems from happening. But typically, most toddlers who are breastfeeding through the night are not getting cavities.
Right. Right. That's what I thought too.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And we did stop breastfeeding through the night around, I want to say like right around 2 years. And that actually made the biggest difference in the supply issue that I had been having all along.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a game changer. It all of a sudden started to feel like, oh, even though I don't really see an end in sight, it feels okay. It feels okay now because I don't have these additional issues. The milk blisters stopped, the engorgement stopped, having to wear breast pads stopped. It just became a little bit more of a thing that I also looked forward to, and that felt really good.
And was this something that you initiated, the night weaning?
Yes.
Okay.
Definitely.
Yeah, you're like, "Oh, yeah." Yeah, so tell me about how that went, night weaning.
Oh goodness. Well, I had been away in through the nights previously because when I'm at births, we don't know when they're going to happen, and sometimes I'm gone for 3 hours and sometimes I'm gone for 3 days. We had gotten to a point around maybe 18 months or so, 18 months postpartum, where he wasn't taking milk through the night when I wasn't there. So I started to kind of think about, if I'm not there and he's not taking in milk at night, that gives me an inkling that it's not really a thing that we need to do together on our feeding journey anymore. And so I started to kind of dabble with it. And when he would ask for a feeding in the middle of the night, I would be like, oh, no, like we'll wait till the morning. We'll wait till the morning. And it wasn't working. And so we continued until he was about to nurse through the night because it just felt like he was not ready. We were not on the same page. And then I started having conversations with him about it and saying that we were going to continue our feeding journey. He calls it Milkies. So we're going to continue doing Milkies when the sun shines. And we started reading that book about, like, I forget what the title is.
I think it's Milkies When the Sun Shines, actually.
Yeah, something. I think that's the title. So we had that book. We started reading it, talking about it, and I ended up actually sleeping at my parents' for like 4 nights in a row. But we told him that it was going to be like a practice journey of like mommy going to sleep at Nana's and getting some extra sleep and you not having milk. And we were like very honest about the whole thing. And there were, for the first 2 nights, he was a little bit uncomfortable and showing some signs of confusion with my partner. But after the first few nights, he was really cool with it. And when I came back, he did not ask for it in the night at all.
Wow.
Yeah. So I didn't ask anybody for advice on how to do that. I kind of just like really tuned in and went with what was going to work for our family during that time and season. It made what I thought was going to be the end of our feeding journey feel like we could continue. And that made me feel just so grateful.
Yeah, I love that. I love
Yeah.
that. That sounds great. And the fact that you thought about it before and then you realized, okay, he's not ready. And then you felt like you could try it again
Right.
when you could have those conversations. And I always tell people when I'm having weaning consults with them that you're never going to mess anything up. So even if you try and then you're like, okay, this isn't working and you want to change your mind, you can always change your mind. You can always change course. You can always say, okay, I'm going to try it for a week. And then if you're too tired to keep holding the boundary, you can go back. Like, You're not going to mess anything up. And so it's really great that you just tuned in to what you needed to do and you found a way to do it. That sounds fantastic.
Yeah, I like that. I'm going to remember that permission to myself that like you're not going to mess things up. Just listen to yourself and take it one moment at a time.
Yeah, I think we get all these messages like, no, you got to hold the boundary. And I say to my kids all the time, I might set a boundary. And then I'm like, you know what? I'm feeling too tired to hold that boundary today. So
Same.
We're going to lift the screen time limits right now, whatever it is. And they get that. They're humans too,
Right. Absolutely. Especially as a toddler parent, that very much resonates with me.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, amazing. So you're still continuing, and now that the night feeding has gone, it gave you more energy and you felt more connected during feeding during the day.
Yes, I felt like I could continue in a way that worked for both of us.
Mm-hmm.
And that was something that I was missing for a little while. I even remember texting Lex a few times being like, I'm not sure how much longer I could do this. And I think she probably waited for me to continue saying, I'm not sure how much longer I could do this. And then she was like, oh, she's got it figured out.
Yeah. That's great.
And I'm sure I'll get to that point again and reach out to a lactation professional to figure out what that might look like.
Yeah. Or not. You figured it out on your own for night weaning. So
that's true.
Yeah.
I think I'll need more support with this with this one.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing your feeding journey with me. It's really a beautiful one. And it's one of those great ones where it's not entirely void of struggle.
Right.
But it shows what it can look like when we set ourselves up to have success and to have the support that we need. And so it's really great that you were able to do that in a time where so many people had so few support systems available.
Yes, incredibly grateful for that.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
A story like Jen's reminds us that setting yourself up for support really can make all the difference. One of those ways that you really can set yourself up for support is by going to feastandfettle.com and using my code MILK to get $30 off your first week. You can have home-cooked meals delivered right to you, whether you are pregnant currently or in the postpartum period. Why not let somebody else plan and cook your meals for you? You really do deserve to let somebody else carry that mental load for you. Another way to find support is by joining my Milk Making Minutes community group. This is a place where both parents and professionals come together to discuss the barriers that exist that make feeding our babies so difficult. So in those moments when you are wondering, why does this keep happening? Why do I feel so frustrated? Or everything's going fine, yet I still feel so lonely. It's the place where we can discuss those barriers, where we can detangle why things feel so hard, even in the best of baby feeding situations. So join my Milk Making Minutes community group on Facebook. I can't wait to see you there. Bye.